Welcome back, y'all. Second episode today, we're going to talk about social engineering. So one of the main principles or processes involved in hacking is called social engineering, or in other words, social control exerted by a hacker on potential targets or victims, which is meant to convince them to give up certain information or act in a certain way, such as to make the technical aspects of hacking a lot easier, if not, obviously, entirely unnecessary. So for example, someone could call you and say that they're someone else. And, if they do a good job imitating them, or you don't know what that person sounds like or something like that, they may succeed in getting you to give up a password or something else of that nature. So they might say, call and pretend to be a boss that you're not familiar with, and they just looked up the boss's name and said, hey, I'm Jim, So that would be one example. There's many other examples from hacking. And in the technical application, in hacking is obviously the widespread usage, I would say, of social engineering, at least today. But the terminology has also been used as a synonym for the intention behind what we call social control, obviously in the social sciences. So in regards to that, consider this following passage from the book, The Tragedy of Political Science from 1984. We'll start here in the first paragraph in the middle or near the bottom. It says, a notion of serendipitous incremental change rather than deliberate and long-range planning based on popular participation and consent became the hallmark of modern political science teachings. One early example of enthusiasm for incremental change came in Politics, Economics, and Welfare by Dahl and Lindblom. Here, concepts from the new liberal matrix were plainly and forcefully expressed, with frequent references to Karl Popper and his book, The Open Society. Human irrationality was admitted, if somewhat overstated, in the assertion that, quote, like Winnie the Pooh, he, man, is an animal of very limited brain, unquote. From this quote-unquote obvious limitation on our capacity for intelligent thought, elaborated with suitable references to Freud and psychological problems such as compulsion, rationalization, and repression, Dahl and Lindblom went on to observe that circumstances and surroundings must also be taken into account when men seek to act. It followed that where our talent for understanding is small and social pressures are great, the most efficient course of action must consist of, quote, incrementalism, which Popper had called piecemeal social engineering. By incrementalism, Dahl and Lindblom meant a series of policy adjustments starting from the basis of existing policy, recognizing its advantages and disadvantages, and continuing in small steps via calculated risks, where immediate additions to old policy will not at once achieve all goals, but at the same time will not unduly invite unforeseen consequences. Here was a process of social choice aimed at avoiding the temptations of quote-unquote utopian thinking that masquerade as rational calculation and designed instead to proceed on the basis of cautious steps forward whose results we can, given our limitations, predict fairly well. So obviously this author has, pretty positive views to some degree. I mean, the book is called The Tragedy of Political Science, so not completely positive views, but he appreciates in some way the sort of ideological foundations of what's going on here. And essentially they're saying a very common theme in political science, which is that, the average person is as dumb as Winnie the Pooh, basically, is what they're trying to say. Which, is interesting for a lot of reasons. But, yeah, so like I said, in short, early political scientists and social scientists, like the elite families who tend to fund a lot of the research that they do, that we do, believe that the average American or even person was basically an imbecile. As a result, despite the contradictory American beliefs in individualism, liberalism, and liberty, a tendency toward programming the population through quote-unquote incremental developments and insights of science developed. These often patronizing and elitist attitudes, no doubt, contribute to the anti-intellectualism that academics complain about. Why would the population trust elite scientists who refer to them as being like, quote-unquote, Winnie the Pooh, and indeed of piecemeal social engineering, according to Karl Popper? Now, returning to the hacking context, let's consider the following passage from Joe Gray's, quote-unquote, Practical Social Engineering. Chapter 1, What is Social Engineering, says, social engineering is any attack that leverages human psychology to influence a target, making them either perform an action or provide some information. These attacks play a role in the information security industry and hacker community, but you've probably seen examples of similar behavior in your life as well. Excuse me. For example, Sales and marketing teams often use social engineering tactics. A salesperson who cold calls potential customers might try to influence people on the other end of the line by pitching solutions to their problems. Children often mention what the cool kids are doing as a means to gain authority with their parents, while parents may give exaggerated warnings about consequences of whatever the child is seeking permission to do. Many of the people reading this book most likely have answered a call from quote-unquote the Microsofts or received an email from a Nigerian prince. He also mentions, sextortion, bomb threats, all this other stuff that I probably shouldn't say and may have to censor myself saying so that I don't get in trouble. But anyway, as Gray explains, this phenomenon should remind us not only of the behavior associated with scams, extortion, and other kinds of coercive persuasion, but also something as commonplace and trivially regarded as advertising. Those familiar with the history of advertising and propaganda as relates to Edward Bernays, who is famous for making ads that, push smoking on women and claim that it was healthy, among a number of other things. You can look up the documentary, The Century of Self, on YouTube and watch that if you want to learn more about him and about the history of advertising. But people familiar with that history will understand how this relates directly to social engineering. In effect, salespeople and advertisers are engaged in the same behavior as government and military propagandists, scammers, and hackers. They're attempting to facilitate some kind of behavior control through exploitation of psychological warfare techniques outside of psychological warfare contexts. Where they try to get you to give up information you might not otherwise, they're of course interested in the same sciences as those who study behavior modification, like psychologists, and other more taboo formulations of social engineering. All in all, social engineering as a phrase proves as a sort of portal to other technologies and euphemisms for social control. Due to the word engineering, it's clear that there's a mechanistic, scientific, and ultimately reality-shaping intent behind acts that fall into this category. This in many ways draws into question the commonplace notion that social scientists put forward of their own objectivity and avoidance of normative proclamations. Normative meaning, having to do with how things should be, basically. They are, in theory, supposed to be neutral, social scientists that is, relative, and focused on basically showing what can be proven with, the evidence that we have and our sort of methodologies and tools for understanding what's true, as opposed to giving recommendations about what's best to do. Obviously, that's more in the realm of what we call policy and philosophy and theory. Now, with this context in mind, one has to begin to interrogate what the particular agenda of any given scientist may be, especially, of course, social scientists. Having an agenda or perspective is a natural human tendency that social scientists can't actually escape from, at least in my opinion. Obviously, it's a noble cause, but it is fundamentally inescapable. We're human beings. We have our own perspective at the end of the day. And, despite how hard we may try, it's always going to sort of seep into what we're doing. So the important thing is to be honest about what your perspective is and what your biases may be. But of course, there are a number of institutional incentives and personal, career kind of incentives and other psychological maybe incentives to not really talk about that. Maybe even some political incentives if you wanted to, for example, socially engineer a population and claim that you weren't trying to do that. But of course also raises the question, how many scientists are consciously aware of how their work fits into producing knowledge that can ultimately be used for mass social engineering, especially given the modern age with mass surveillance, big data, and so on.